Somewhere beneath the soil you walk on, beneath the fields and forests and forgotten corners of the earth, there are cities that once held millions of people, temples that reached toward the heavens, and streets that echoed with languages no one alive today can speak, all of them now silent, all of them waiting to be remembered. Tonight, we explore the lost civilizations of the ancient world, the empires that rose in brilliance and then vanished into the sand and jungle and the quiet drift of time. This is not a history lesson. This is a journey through the ruins of human memory, a lullaby sung by the stones. Welcome to Drowsy Discovery. Over the next 2 hours, over 100 gentle facts will carry you through forgotten kingdoms and buried secrets. There is nothing to memorize, nothing to remember. Just listen and let your mind drift. Have you ever wondered what stories lie beneath the ground you stand on? You are not alone. If these quiet journeys help you find rest, consider subscribing. Together, we are building a space where curiosity meets calm, one sleepy soul at a time. For now, let your breath slow. Let your shoulders settle into the surface beneath you. The world outside can wait. The ancient stones have waited for thousands of years. They can wait a little longer for you to find your peace. Let us begin. A civilization can vanish without leaving a single word behind. Throughout history, entire peoples have risen, flourished, built cities and empires, and then disappeared so completely that not a single inscription, not a single scratched symbol survives to tell us who they were, and we are left only with the things they left behind, the pottery fragments, the bones, the outlines of walls beneath the soil, trying to piece together the story of lives lived in languages we will never hear spoken. And in some ways, this silence is the deepest mystery of all. Because we know these people loved and feared and dreamed and remembered, but their inner worlds are gone, lost to the turning of centuries, and all that remains is the shape of absence, the outline of a people who once were here and are now nowhere at all. Memory fades into silence. More than 1,000 cities lie buried beneath modern towns. Beneath the streets where cars drive and people walk to work, there are older streets, older walls, older foundations that belong to cities with different names and different peoples. And in Rome and Athens and Cairo and Mexico City, if you dig down far enough, you will find layer upon layer of human habitation, each one resting on the bones of what came before, and the buildings we call ancient were themselves built on the ruins of something older still, and this layering of time is everywhere. Invisible beneath the surface of the modern world, so that in a very real sense, we are always walking on the graves of civilizations we have never heard of, our footsteps crossing paths with those of people who lived and died before our cities had names. The past is always underfoot. Some civilizations were erased so completely that we only discovered them by accident. The Indus Valley Civilization, one of the largest and most sophisticated cultures of the ancient world, was entirely unknown to modern historians until railway workers in 19th century India stumbled upon its bricks and began using them for track ballast. And the Hittite Empire, which once rivaled Egypt, was so thoroughly forgotten that when archaeologists finally identified its ruins, they had to invent a name for a people who had vanished from memory for 3,000 years. And there are surely other civilizations still waiting in the earth, cities we do not yet know existed, peoples whose names we have not yet learned, and the accidents that will reveal them have not yet happened, waiting beneath the soil for some fortunate stumble that will bring them back into the light of human awareness and memory. Discovery sometimes comes by chance. The oldest known city in the world was built before the pyramids existed. Uruk in ancient Mesopotamia was already a thriving urban center around 5,000 years ago, its streets crowded with merchants and priests and craftsmen, its temples rising above the flat plains of the Tigris and Euphrates, and at its peak, It may have held more than 40,000 people, making it the largest settlement on Earth at a time when the Great Pyramid of Giza would not be built for another 500 years. And if you could stand on its walls and look out across the irrigated fields, you would see a world that was already old, already layered with tradition and memory, a civilization that had been building and growing for centuries before the pharaohs learned to stack their stones. Antiquity has its own depths. Ancient peoples invented writing at least 3 times, in 3 different places, with no connection between them. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, and in China, human beings independently arrived at the same astonishing and remarkable idea, that sounds and meanings could be fixed in visible marks on clay or stone or bone, that thoughts could be preserved beyond the lifespan of the thinker. And this remarkable convergence suggests that writing is not an accident, but something that emerges naturally when societies grow complex enough to need it. A technology invented not once, but again and again, in complete isolation, by peoples who never knew the others existed, and each of these writing systems took different forms, different shapes, different paths toward the same ultimate destination, the preservation of human thought across the gulf of time, a testament to humanity's universal need to remember and communicate. The mind reaches for permanence. And from the birth of written memory, we turn to something older still, the very first settlements that humans called home. The first permanent settlement may have been built by people who had not yet learned to farm. At Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, massive stone pillars carved with animal figures stand in circles on a hilltop, and they were built more than 11,000 years ago, before pottery, before metalworking, before agriculture, by hunter-gatherers who had not yet planted their first crop or domesticated any animal. And this remarkable discovery upended everything archaeologists thought they knew about the origins of civilization. Because it suggested that humans did not settle down because they learned to farm, but perhaps they learned to farm because they had already settled down, drawn together by beliefs and rituals and the desire to build something lasting, something greater than any single lifetime could ever contain or accomplish. Belief may have come before bread. Çatalhöyük had no streets, and people entered their homes through the roof. This 9,000-year-old settlement in central Turkey was a maze of interconnected houses, each one sharing walls with its neighbors, with no pathways or alleys between them, and the only way in or out was through a hole in the roof, down a wooden ladder into the living space below, where families cooked and slept and buried their honored dead beneath the plastered floor, and the rooftops themselves served as the streets. A second level of the city, where people walked and gathered and talked and traded and looked out across the honeycomb of their community under the open sky, and to live there must have been to feel wrapped in neighbors, pressed close to the warmth and breath of others. A way of life utterly unlike anything we know today, a community built on closeness that modern people with their private walls and separate doorways can barely begin to imagine or understand. Home was entered from above. The Sumerians invented the wheel, the plow, and the 60-minute hour. In the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, more than 5,000 years ago, the Sumerian people created tools and systems so useful, so deeply practical, that we still use them today in our everyday lives. And the wheel that rolls beneath your car, the plow that turns the soil in distant fields, and the 60 minutes you count through every hour of your life, all trace their origins to this single culture, this single place in ancient Mesopotamia. And though the Sumerians themselves are long gone, their inventions remain woven into the fabric of daily life all around the world, silent gifts from a people whose names we have mostly forgotten, whose faces we will never see. Their ideas outlived their empire. Cuneiform, the earliest writing system, began as a way to count sheep and grain. The Sumerians did not set out to record poetry or history or law. They simply needed to keep careful track of the temple stores, how many jars of barley, how many head of cattle, and so they pressed wedge-shaped marks into soft clay tablets, symbols that stood for numbers and things, and only later did these marks evolve into something more, a system capable of capturing language itself, capable of holding the words of priests and kings and lonely scribes who scratched their names into the margins of their work. And what began as simple accounting became literature, became memory, became the earliest window into the minds of people long since turned to dust. A transformation so profound that it changed the very nature of human existence and made it possible for thoughts to outlive the thinkers who first conceived them. Bureaucracy gave birth to poetry. The library of Ashurbanipal held over 30,000 clay tablets and the oldest known version of the flood story. In the 7th century BCE, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal gathered texts from across his empire and housed them in his palace at Nineveh, creating the first systematically organized library in history. And among its treasures was the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that includes an account of a great flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity, written more than 1,000 years before the Hebrew Bible recorded its own flood narrative. And when Henry Layard unearthed these tablets in the 19th century, cracked and soil-stained after millennia of burial, scholars realized that the stories they had always thought were unique to their own tradition reached further back than they had ever imagined, into the misty depths of Mesopotamian memory. Old stories travel far. We now travel south along the great rivers to a land where kingdoms rose from the desert sand. The Egyptians built the pyramids with astonishing precision, aligning them to the cardinal points within a fraction of a degree. With nothing but simple tools, copper chisels, wooden rollers, and the unaided human eye, the builders of the Great Pyramid at Giza achieved an alignment to true north that would challenge modern engineers. And the base of the pyramid is level to within just over 2 centimeters across its entire 440-meter perimeter. And we still do not entirely understand how they did it, how they moved millions of limestone blocks weighing several tons each, how they cut them so precisely, how they raised them to such heights. And the best answer we have is time, patience, and an organization of labor so vast that it became a civilization-defining project, the work of an entire nation building a monument to eternity. Precision defies the ages. Hieroglyphics remained unreadable for over 1,000 years, until a single stone changed everything. When Napoleon's soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone in Egypt in 1799, they found an inscription written in 3 scripts: Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics. And because scholars could read Greek, they finally had a key, a way to crack the code that had baffled them for centuries. And it still took more than 20 years before Jean-François Champollion announced the decipherment in 1822, and when the meaning of the ancient symbols finally became clear. It was as if a door opened onto 3,000 years of human history that had been standing silent, waiting for someone to learn how to listen, a library of the dead given voice again after centuries of silence, speaking across millennia to anyone patient enough to learn the shapes of their ancient and beautiful letters. One stone unlocked an empire. The Egyptians performed brain surgery and knew how to set broken bones. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a medical text written nearly 4,000 years ago, describes case after case of injuries and their treatments, including detailed instructions for treating skull fractures and evidence that Egyptian physicians drilled into skulls to relieve pressure, a procedure we now call trepanation. And remarkably, some of these patients survived because their skulls show signs of healing after the operation. And the papyrus also catalogs the treatment of broken arms and legs and dislocated shoulders, all set out with a clinical detachment that feels surprisingly modern, as if we are reading the notes of a doctor who worked centuries before Hippocrates was born, already practicing what we would recognize as medicine with remarkable skill and compassion, healing the sick and mending the broken with knowledge painstakingly gathered over many generations of careful observation and trial. Ancient hands could heal. Cleopatra lived closer in time to the moon landing than to the building of the Great Pyramid. This simple fact scrambles our sense of deep time because we tend to lump all of ancient Egypt together. But the truth is that when Cleopatra ruled from Alexandria in the 1st century BCE, the pyramids at Giza were already more than 2,500 years old, already ancient beyond reckoning, already crumbling monuments to a past so distant that even she could not read the inscriptions left by their builders. And if you measure the centuries, you find that the gap between Cleopatra and the moon landing is shorter than the gap between Cleopatra and Khufu, the pharaoh who ordered the Great Pyramid to be built, and history is deeper than we ever imagine. Time spirals beyond measure. The last pharaoh was buried and then lost, and we still do not know where she lies. When Cleopatra died, probably by her own hand, in 30 BCE, she was said to have been buried with her beloved Mark Antony in a great mausoleum in Alexandria. But centuries of earthquakes, devastating floods, and urban development have buried the ancient city beneath the modern one. And despite underwater excavations and years of patient searching, archaeologists have not yet found her tomb, and somewhere beneath the streets or beneath the waves of the harbor, the last queen of Egypt may still rest in her sarcophagus, undiscovered and unvisited, waiting for the chance that will bring her back to the light, or perhaps already lost, forever beneath the sediment of time and the weight of the sea, a royal mystery that endures. A queen remains hidden. Let these thoughts drift gently now. There is no need to hold onto any of them. Let your breath find its own rhythm, slow and easy, like the turning of ancient sand. And now we journey east, to a river valley where one of the world's most mysterious civilizations flourished. The Indus Valley Civilization had running water and public baths before any European city did. More than 4,000 years ago, while Europe was still scattered with small farming villages and had not yet developed any sophisticated urban culture, the ancient cities of the Indus Valley had sophisticated drainage systems, covered sewers that carried waste away from homes and into municipal channels, and many houses had their own private wells and bathing platforms, and the great city of Mohenjo-Daro contained a massive public bath called the Great Bath. A brick-lined pool with steps leading down carefully into the water, possibly used for ritual purification ceremonies, and the sophisticated engineering required to build these systems speaks of a civilization obsessed with order and cleanliness, a people who valued hygiene as much as any modern city dweller. And all of this was lost forever when the cities were abandoned, swallowed by time and sand, until archaeologists rediscovered them thousands of years later and marveled at what they found. Water once flowed in perfect order. No one has ever deciphered the Indus script, though thousands of inscriptions survive. On clay seals and pottery fragments and copper tablets found throughout the ruins of the Indus Valley, there are short inscriptions in a script that no one today can read or understand, and despite decades of dedicated effort by linguists and archaeologists around the world, scholars have not been able to crack the code, partly because the inscriptions are too short to provide enough context, partly because we do not know what language the Indus people spoke, and this silence is maddening. Because the writings exist, thousands of them, waiting to tell us something about the people who made them, yet remaining stubbornly mute, holding secrets that may never be revealed, a language on the edge of speech that will not speak. The script keeps its silence. The city of Mohenjo-Daro had remarkably uniform bricks across hundreds of buildings. Every brick found in Mohenjo-Daro follows the same proportions, a ratio of 4 to 2 to 1, length to width to height, and this remarkable and consistent standardization holds true across the entire city and across other Indus Valley sites hundreds of kilometers away, suggesting a central authority or shared tradition powerful enough to impose uniformity on construction practices throughout the civilization. And the precision is remarkable. As if a building code existed 4,000 years before such things were invented elsewhere. And the consistency speaks of planning, of meticulous organization, of a society that prized order and careful measurement as fundamental values, though the reasons behind this fascinating obsession remain tantalizingly unknown, leaving modern scholars to wonder what kind of authority could enforce such remarkable uniformity across such vast distances and through so many generations. Standards were carved into clay. The Indus people may have traded directly with ancient Mesopotamia. Seals and artifacts from the Indus Valley have been found in Mesopotamian cities and archaeological sites, and Mesopotamian texts refer to a distant and mysterious land called Meluhha, which many scholars believe was the Indus civilization, a source of luxury goods like carnelian beads, ivory, copper, and precious metals, shipped across the Arabian Sea or overland through the deserts of Persia. And this trade network linked two of the world's earliest civilizations in a web of commerce that predates the Silk Road by 2,000 years, a reminder that the ancient world was far more connected than we often imagine, with merchants and sailors and caravans carrying goods and ideas across vast and treacherous distances. Commerce bridged the ancient world. No temples, palaces, or royal tombs have ever been found in the Indus Valley cities. Unlike the pharaohs of Egypt or the kings of Mesopotamia, the rulers of the Indus civilization left no monuments to themselves, no grand tombs filled with golden treasures, no palace complexes displaying their power and dominion over the people, and this absence has puzzled archaeologists for decades, leading some to wonder whether the Indus cities were governed differently, perhaps by councils or priests rather than all-powerful kings. Or perhaps their rulers simply did not value the same kinds of ostentatious display that characterized other ancient cultures, and without written records, we cannot know, and so the question of who ruled these cities and how remains one of the deepest and most intriguing mysteries of the ancient world, a puzzle that may never be solved unless some breakthrough discovery reveals the truth that has eluded scholars for so long. Power left no trace. From the rivers of Asia, we now sail across the Mediterranean to an island where a mysterious culture once thrived. The Minoan civilization built elaborate palaces with indoor plumbing 4,000 years ago. On the island of Crete, the Minoans constructed vast palace complexes with central courtyards, light wells, and sophisticated drainage systems that carried fresh water through terracotta pipes beneath the polished floors. And the palace at Knossos had flush toilets connected to running water, a level of domestic sophistication that Europe would not see again for thousands of years. And these palaces were not merely residences, but administrative and religious centers. Decorated with vibrant frescoes showing dolphins and acrobats and processions of priests, and when archaeologist Arthur Evans excavated Knossos in the early 20th century, he was astonished by what he found: a civilization older than classical Greece that had flourished and vanished, leaving only ruins and riddles behind. Plumbing flowed beneath painted walls. The Minoans may have inspired the legend of Atlantis. When the great Greek philosopher Plato wrote about a powerful island civilization that sank beneath the waves in a single catastrophic day and night, he may have been drawing on faint memories of the Minoan collapse, because the Minoans were a sophisticated maritime power that dominated the Aegean, and then suddenly declined after a catastrophic volcanic eruption on the nearby island of Thera around 1500 BCE, and some scholars believe that the echoes of this disaster. A rich civilization, destroyed apparently overnight by forces beyond human control, filtered down through centuries of oral tradition until Plato transformed them into his philosophical myth of Atlantis, a story of hubris and destruction that still captivates readers today, borrowed perhaps from the real tragedy of a vanished and forgotten people. Myth may carry memory. A volcanic eruption buried an entire Minoan town, preserving it like a time capsule. The site of Akrotiri on the island of Santorini, the modern name for ancient Thera, was buried beneath meters of volcanic ash when the island's volcano exploded in one of the largest eruptions in human history, sending shockwaves across the Aegean Sea. And when archaeologists began excavating in the 1960s, they found multi-story buildings still standing, streets still intact, and frescoes still clinging to the walls. And unlike Pompeii, no bodies have been found, which suggests the inhabitants fled before the worst of the eruption, but they left behind a frozen moment in time, pottery on shelves, furniture in rooms, a glimpse into daily life that would otherwise have vanished utterly and completely, preserved by the very catastrophe that drove the inhabitants away and buried their homes beneath layers of volcanic debris and silence. Ash preserved what time destroys. Linear A, the Minoan writing system, has never been translated. Although dedicated scholars have identified many of the symbols and can recognize that certain tablets are inventories or records of religious offerings made to unknown gods, they cannot actually read Linear A because the language behind it remains utterly unknown and may belong to a linguistic family that has left no other surviving traces. And unlike Linear B, a later script that was deciphered in the 1950s and revealed to be an early form of Greek, Linear A has stubbornly resisted all attempts at translation, leaving us with tablets covered in writing that we can see but cannot understand, messages recorded 4,000 years ago that now wait in silence, their meaning perhaps recoverable someday through some breakthrough discovery, or perhaps lost forever along with the voices that once spoke them in ancient palaces and temples of a vanished world. A language waits to be heard. The Minoans worshipped goddesses and held sacred ceremonies with bulls. Frescoes from Minoan palaces show young men and women leaping over the backs of charging bulls, an athletic feat so dangerous that some scholars believe it must have been a dangerous religious ritual rather than mere sport or entertainment. And the Minoans seem to have venerated a goddess associated with snakes and wild nature, depicted in figurines with bared breasts and serpents coiled around her arms. And these images suggest a culture with very different religious sensibilities from the later Greek gods, a world in which the feminine divine held central importance, and the bull was a sacred animal, perhaps a symbol of the wild forces that even the most sophisticated and advanced civilization cannot fully control or predict, forces that shape their entire world in ways we are only beginning to understand through careful archaeological investigation and decades of patient scholarly study. Bulls charged through sacred halls. And from the islands of the Aegean, we now travel westward to the shores of what would become Rome. The Etruscans taught the Romans how to build arches, roads, and a calendar. Before Rome became the great empire we remember, it was a small city ruled by powerful Etruscan kings who brought with them knowledge that would shape Roman civilization for many centuries to come, including the art of constructing true arches, the engineering of paved roads, and the division of the year into 12 months with the same names we still use today. And Roman temples, togas, and even the ceremony of the triumph all began as Etruscan customs, borrowed and adapted by a people who would eventually forget how much they owed to their teachers and neighbors, erasing the Etruscans from history while continuing to live in the world the Etruscans built for them, never acknowledging the debt they owed to those they absorbed. Rome learned before it conquered. No one knows where the Etruscans came from or what language family theirs belongs to. The Etruscan language survives in many thousands of inscriptions, enough for scholars to understand many individual words and grammatical structures. But the language has no known relatives, no clear connection to any other language family, ancient or modern. And ancient writers disagreed about whether the Etruscans migrated from Asia Minor or had always lived in the green rolling hills of central Italy. And modern DNA studies have given contradictory and often deeply puzzling results. And so the Etruscans remain a profound mystery, a people who rose to prominence in the Italian peninsula, flourished for centuries, and then faded completely into Rome, taking the answers to our questions with them into the long silence of time and leaving scholars utterly baffled and searching for clues that may never be found despite decades of patient research. Origins stay hidden in shadow. Etruscan women had more freedom than Roman women did centuries later. Unlike the women of Rome, who were expected to remain in domestic seclusion and emerge only rarely into public life, and always under male supervision, Etruscan women attended banquets reclining beside their husbands as social equals, participated actively in public spectacles and religious ceremonies, and were commemorated in elaborate tomb paintings and inscriptions that named them as individuals rather than merely as wives and mothers defined only by their relationships to men. And Greek and Roman writers were deeply scandalized by this remarkable freedom, seeing it as a sign of moral looseness and decadence. But the Etruscans clearly valued women differently, granting them a visibility and personal dignity that would become unthinkable in the more rigid patriarchies that followed, a glimpse into a society where the lines between male and female spheres were drawn far less sharply. Women once stood beside their husbands. The Etruscans were renowned goldsmiths whose techniques remain unmatched. Etruscan jewelers perfected a method called granulation, in which thousands upon thousands of tiny gold spheres smaller than grains of sand are carefully fused to a gold surface to create intricate patterns and textures of extraordinary beauty. And although modern metallurgists have tried repeatedly to replicate the technique using advanced technology, no one has been able to match the precision of the Etruscan craftsmen, who worked without magnifying lenses and without the sophisticated tools we consider essential, producing works of art so fine that they seem impossible even to trained modern eyes, relics of a mastery that died with the civilization that created it, sitting now in museum cases as evidence of a skill we can admire but cannot fully understand or hope to replicate with even our most advanced modern methods and tools. Gold holds secrets in silence. Roman culture slowly absorbed the Etruscans until they simply ceased to exist as a distinct people. There was no conquest, no dramatic final battle, just a slow and gradual process of assimilation in which Etruscan cities became Roman cities. Etruscan families adopted Roman names and customs and language, and the Etruscan tongue was spoken less and less, until by the 1st century CE, it was studied only by scholarly antiquarians curious about the old gods and old rituals and forgotten prophecies. And within a few generations, more even that curiosity faded into oblivion. And the Etruscans vanished not with a war cry, but with a whisper, absorbed so completely into Roman identity that we can only glimpse them now through archaeology and the faint traces they left behind, echoes of a culture that shaped Rome but was then silently erased by the very civilization it had helped to create. A people faded into another. We now cross the mountains to the north, where painted warriors once defended their homeland. The Picts of Scotland left behind carved stones, but almost no written records. Scattered across the landscape of northern and eastern Scotland, There stand hundreds of carved stones bearing intricate designs of animals, spirals, and abstract symbols that no one today can fully interpret. And these monuments are almost all we have left of the Picts, who kept no written chronicles of their own, no histories or poems or records of their kings, and what we know of them comes from the writings of their enemies and neighbors, the Romans and the later Scots and the Irish monks. And the Picts themselves remain largely silent, their stories erased or absorbed, leaving only these mysterious stones to speak in a language we cannot read, a language carved in granite that whispers across the centuries. Stone speaks what words forgot. The name Pict comes from the Latin word for painted people. Roman writers called them Picti, the painted ones, because these fierce northern warriors decorated their bodies with elaborate tattoos or woad, a blue dye extracted from plants, and the name stuck even after the Romans retreated behind their Great Wall, becoming the only name we have for a people who must have called themselves something else entirely. A true name now lost to history, replaced by a Latin word that tells us only how they appeared to foreign eyes. Marked with intricate patterns that may have identified their clans or status, or simply proclaimed their defiance to anyone who dared to face them across a battlefield, warriors who wore their identity on their skin for all to see, a people named by their enemies. Pictish symbols remain undeciphered, though patterns repeat across hundreds of stones. On the standing stones and tall cross slabs left behind by the Picts, diligent scholars and careful researchers have catalogued dozens of recurring symbols, crescent moons and double discs, serpents twisting through elegant spirals and mirrors and combs, and these enigmatic images appear in consistent combinations across sites hundreds of miles apart, suggesting they formed some kind of elaborate language or system of meaning. But we do not know what they actually said, whether they marked graves, proclaimed great victories, or carefully recorded genealogies and royal lineages, and the key to their meaning died with the people who carved them, leaving us to stare at these beautiful and mysterious stones and wonder what messages they once conveyed to those who could read their meaning. Symbols repeat without revealing. The Picts successfully resisted Roman conquest for centuries. While the Romans conquered most of Britain, they never truly subdued the far north, and the Emperor Hadrian built his famous and impressive wall in part to keep the fierce Picts at bay, and later emperors tried and failed to conquer the unforgiving highlands, and the fierce Pictish warriors remained free, raiding south whenever Roman discipline weakened, a constant threat lingering on the edge of an empire that could not reach them, undefeated and unbowed. And when the Romans finally withdrew from Britain in the 5th century, the Picts were still there, still unconquered, having outlasted the greatest military power the ancient world had ever known through sheer stubborn resistance and deep knowledge of their harsh and unforgiving terrain. They never bent to Rome. After merging with the Scots in the 9th century, the Pictish identity vanished almost overnight. Sometime around 843 CE, the Pictish and Scottish kingdoms united under a single king, Kenneth Mac Alpin, and within a generation or two, the Pictish language, Pictish customs, and Pictish identity seemed simply to disappear, absorbed so completely into the new Scottish kingdom that historians still argue about what really happened, whether the Picts were conquered or simply outnumbered, whether their culture was suppressed or simply faded away as old ways gave way to new. And the speed of their vanishing remains one of the great puzzles of early medieval Britain, a people who had resisted Rome for centuries but could not survive the embrace of peaceful unity, their distinct voice silenced not by war but by merger. Unity erased a nation. And from the cold north, we travel far to the south, to the heart of Africa. Great Zimbabwe was built by an African kingdom using no mortar, only perfectly fitted stone. The great enclosure at Zimbabwe contains walls over 11 meters high and 6 meters thick at the base, built from granite blocks cut so precisely that they fit together without any binding material or mortar of any kind. And the craftsmanship is absolutely extraordinary, with elaborate chevron patterns decorating the upper courses and conical towers rising from the walls like stone sentinels watching over the valley below. And the builders of this great monument belonged to the Shona people, who created a wealthy and powerful kingdom here between the 11th and 15th centuries, rulers of a trading state that left behind evidence of a sophisticated culture that needed no foreign architects to achieve such greatness. A civilization that built in stone with a precision and artistry that still astonishes visitors who stand before these ancient walls and marvel at the skill of their builders. Stone fitted without mortar. When Europeans first found the ruins, they refused to believe Africans could have built them. When European colonizers encountered the great ruins of Zimbabwe in the 19th century, they invented elaborate and entirely false theories to explain them, claiming that Phoenicians or Arabs, or perhaps the legendary Queen of Sheba, must have built these walls, because their deeply ingrained racism could not accept that indigenous Africans were capable of such magnificent achievements, and these false theories persisted for many decades. Supported by colonial governments who found the uncomfortable truth politically inconvenient, until archaeologists finally proved beyond any doubt that Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people, an African civilization that needed no outside help to create one of the most impressive architectural sites on the entire continent, a truth that should never have been questioned, but was denied for decades by those who could not see past their own narrow assumptions. Prejudice blinded colonial eyes. The city was home to perhaps 18,000 people at its height. At its peak between the 13th and 15th centuries, the city of Great Zimbabwe was one of the largest urban centers in all of sub-Saharan Africa, supporting a thriving population that may have reached 18,000 or more, and the surrounding valley held additional settlements, farms, and cattle enclosures, all feeding a capital city whose rulers commanded the wealth of an entire region, and the impressive scale of the ruins hints at the power of those kings. Leaders whose names we have lost forever, but whose ambition is still visible in the walls they left behind, monuments to a great kingdom that flourished while medieval Europe was still struggling through the Dark Ages and its own internal conflicts. A capital rose in Africa. Great Zimbabwe controlled gold and ivory trade routes that stretched to the Indian Ocean. Great Zimbabwe sat at the center of a vast and intricate trading network that connected the African interior to the bustling merchant ports of the Indian Ocean coast, and gold mined from nearby deposits and valuable ivory from elephant herds were eagerly exchanged for colorful glass beads, fine Persian ceramics, and delicate Chinese porcelain, fragments of which have been found carefully scattered among the ancient ruins, evidence of commerce stretching halfway around the world. And the wealth generated by this far-reaching trade built the walls and paid for the craftsmen and sustained the kings who ruled from this great stone citadel, a powerful reminder that Africa was never isolated from global commerce and international exchange, but was always connected to the wider world through networks of trade that stretched across oceans and continents. Trade stretched to distant shores. The city was abandoned around the 15th century, possibly due to environmental stress. By the late 15th century, Great Zimbabwe had been largely abandoned, and scholars believe that a combination of factors may have caused its eventual decline, including steady deforestation, as trees were cut for fuel and building material, overgrazing by cattle herds that exhausted the surrounding land, and political instability as rival powers eventually rose to challenge the kingdom's dominance, and the population gradually dispersed to other centers across the region. And the Great Walls stood empty, slowly being reclaimed by the encroaching bush until Portuguese traders heard rumors of a great stone city in the interior and wondered if they had perhaps found the legendary mines of King Solomon, those fabled repositories of ancient wealth, not understanding that what they had found was something far more miraculous, a civilization that needed no myths to explain its magnificence, a city emptied into silence. Let these images of distant kingdoms settle softly in your mind. There is no test, no requirement, just rest. Let your body grow heavier, your thoughts quieter as the story continues. From the ruins of Africa, we now cross the ocean to the jungles of Central America. The Maya built towering pyramids in the middle of dense rainforest. In cities like Tikal and Calakmul, hidden deep in the jungle, the Maya constructed massive stone pyramids that rose high above the jungle canopy, temples dedicated to their gods and tombs for their kings, built with limestone quarried and carved using only stone tools and the labor of countless workers. And these structures stood hidden beneath the trees for centuries after the cities were abandoned, unknown to the outside world, until explorers stumbled upon them in the 19th century. And even today, archaeologists continue to discover new pyramids beneath the vegetation, using laser scanning to peer through the dense forest canopy and reveal structures that have been waiting in silence for 1,000 years, monuments to a civilization that flourished and vanished long before the Europeans arrived. Pyramids rose above the trees. The Maya developed one of the most accurate calendars the world has ever seen. The Maya carefully tracked the precise and detailed movements of the sun, the moon, and the visible planets with such incredible precision that their calendar was more accurate than the one used in Europe until the Gregorian reform of 1582, and they understood the complex cycles of Venus and could predict eclipses centuries in advance. And all of this without telescopes or any of the instruments we consider essential to modern astronomy. Relying instead on patient observation over generations, recording their findings in books made from bark paper that were later burned by Spanish missionaries who saw only pagan superstition where there was in fact remarkable science, a knowledge painstakingly gathered over centuries and then almost entirely destroyed. Time was measured with precision. Maya scribes wrote in a complex system of glyphs that was only deciphered in the 20th century. Maya writing combined logographic and syllabic elements into one of the most sophisticated writing systems ever developed in the ancient world. And for centuries no one could read it, the symbols dismissed as mere decoration or religious imagery, until scholars in the 20th century finally cracked the code and realized that the inscriptions recorded real history, names and dates and battles and alliances, and suddenly the silent cities began to speak again, telling us about kings and queens whose lives had been lost to oblivion, revealing wars and dynasties and rituals that had been forgotten for 1,000 years, stories carved in stone that simply waited for someone to learn how to listen to their ancient voices, voices that now echo across the centuries. Glyphs spoke after centuries. The Maya understood the concept of zero before most civilizations in the Old World. While the Romans still lacked a symbol for nothing, and European mathematicians would not adopt zero until well into the Middle Ages, the Maya had already developed the concept entirely independently many centuries earlier, using a distinctive shell-shaped symbol to represent the absence of quantity in their vigesimal, or base 20, number system. And this crucial and revolutionary innovation allowed them to perform complex calculations and astronomical computations that would have been completely impossible without it. And the sophistication of their mathematics is another powerful reminder that the Maya were not primitive forest dwellers, but members of a highly complex and sophisticated civilization capable of profound intellectual achievements that matched or exceeded those of the Old World in many remarkable ways. Zero was understood early. Maya cities were connected by raised white roads visible from miles away. The Maya built an extensive network of roads called Sakbiab, meaning white roads, constructed from limestone rubble and plastered white, so that they gleamed in the sunlight and could be seen for great distances across the flat landscape of the Yucatan Peninsula. And these impressive causeways connected cities to each other and to sacred sites like ceremonial cenotes, and some stretched for nearly 100 kilometers through the dense jungle engineering feats that required enormous labor to build and maintain. And their whiteness would have been dramatic and striking under the tropical sun, shining paths leading from one center of power to another across the green expanse of the forest, highways through an ancient world where travel itself was considered sacred. White roads crossed the jungle. We remain in the Americas, but move north to the mysterious mound builders. The Cahokia civilization built a city larger than London at its peak. Around the year 1100 CE, the city of Cahokia in what is now southern Illinois had a population of perhaps 20,000 people, making it larger than London at the same time, and it was the largest settlement north of Mexico before the arrival of Europeans. A city of massive earthen mounds and wooden palisades and thatch-roofed houses, the center of a civilization that archaeologists call Mississippian, and yet most people have never heard of it. A forgotten metropolis that flourished in the heart of North America and then vanished into the mists of time, leaving only its mounds to puzzle later generations who could not believe that indigenous people had built them, their prejudice blinding them to the remarkable achievements that had unfolded on this very continent long before European ships appeared on the horizon. A city rivaled London. Monk's Mound in Cahokia contains more earth than the Great Pyramid contains stone. The large central mound at Cahokia, known as Monk's Mound because French monks once lived nearby, covers more than 6 large hectares and rises 30 meters above the surrounding flat plain, and it was built entirely by hand, one basket load at a time, over many long centuries. And if you measure the volume of earth moved, it exceeds the volume of stone in the Great Pyramid of Giza, and the effort required to construct it was staggering. A monument to the power of the rulers who commanded its construction and to the labor of the thousands of workers who carried the dirt on their backs, building a mountain from the earth beneath their feet, one handful at a time, more earth than the pyramid. The city was abandoned around the 13th century, and no one knows exactly why. By the year 1300, the great city of Cahokia had been largely deserted, and the reasons remain unclear and debated among scholars, though researchers have suggested deforestation, flood, severe drought, endemic warfare, or sudden political collapse, or perhaps some combination of all of these devastating factors, and the descendants of the Cahokians dispersed across the region, their connection to the great city forgotten over generations. Until the mounds became mysteries attributed to mythical mound builders rather than to the ancestors of the people who still lived nearby, and the true builders remained unrecognized for centuries, their achievement erased by time and the prejudice of later settlers who refused to believe what their own eyes told them. Abandonment remains a mystery. Cahokia had a wooden astronomical observatory called Woodhenge. Outside the palisade walls of Cahokia, archaeologists have found a circle of large wooden posts arranged to mark the rising and setting points of the sun at the solstices and equinoxes, a structure they have named Woodhenge after the famous stone circle in Britain, and this solar calendar would have allowed the Cahokians to track the seasons and time their ceremonies, and it reveals a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, a knowledge of the heavens achieved through generations of careful and patient observation. Watching the sun move along the horizon and recording its positions with wooden markers that have long since rotted away, leaving only post holes in the earth to hint at their celestial knowledge. Marks in the ground that tell of a people who looked up at the sky and found patterns there that gave meaning to their lives and structure to their calendar and their sacred ceremonies. Wood marked the sun's path. The people of Cahokia had no written language, so their history remains largely unknown. Because the Cahokians left no written records, we cannot know what they called themselves, what language they spoke, what stories they told around their fires at night, or what gods they worshipped. And everything we know about them comes from archaeology, from the artifacts and bones and traces of buildings left behind in the earth. And this silence is both a gift and a loss, a reminder that whole civilizations can vanish, leaving almost nothing of their inner lives, their hopes and fears and songs and prayers. All of it dissolved into the anonymity of time, leaving only mounds and mystery and questions we may never be able to answer with any certainty despite our most advanced research methods. Silence surrounds their memory. And now we travel south to the high mountains where the Inca forged an empire. The Inca ruled the largest empire in the pre-Columbian Americas without using the wheel. From their capital at Cusco High in the Andes Mountains, the Inca controlled a territory stretching over 4,000 kilometers from modern Colombia to Chile, governing millions of people across mountains, deserts, and forests. And they did this without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals capable of pulling carts, relying instead on human porters and vast trained llamas to move goods along their extensive road network. And the absence of the wheel did not make them primitive, but simply showed that technology follows necessity. And in the steep mountain terrain of the Andes, the wheel offered no practical advantage over sure-footed animals and strong human legs that could climb where carts could never roll, terrain that made wheeled transport impossible. An empire moved on foot. The Inca kept records using knotted strings called quipas. These intricate and remarkable devices consisted of a main cord from which hung dozens or sometimes even hundreds of smaller colored strings, each knotted in patterns that recorded numerical data and perhaps much more. And Spanish chroniclers reported that trained quipu keepers could read histories and laws from these knotted strings, though modern scholars are still working to decipher whether quipas encoded language or only numbers. And either way, they represent a unique and ingenious solution to the problem of record keeping, a civilization that developed an alternative to writing that served their needs for centuries before being suppressed by colonial rulers who could not understand what they were destroying. An entire library tied in thread and lost to colonial ignorance, knowledge encoded in knots that we are only now beginning to partially recover and tentatively interpret. Knots held information. Machu Picchu was built without mortar, yet its stones fit together so precisely that a knife blade cannot slip between them. High in the Andes Mountains, perched on a narrow ridge between two towering peaks, the Inca constructed a magnificent royal estate using a technique called ashlar, in which stones are cut so precisely that they lock together without any binding material. And this ingenious construction has proven remarkably resistant to earthquakes, the stones shifting slightly during tremors and then settling back into place. And the craftsmanship required to achieve such precision with only stone and bronze tools is astonishing. Each block shaped by patient labor over many days until it fitted perfectly against its neighbors, a level of skill that modern stonemasons still greatly admire and struggle to fully replicate despite all their advanced tools, a testament to the patience and precision of craftsmen whose names we will never know but whose work endures. Precision defied the mountains. The Inca road system stretched over 40,000 kilometers through mountains and deserts. The Quhapacnian, or Royal Road, was one of the great engineering marvels of the ancient world. an incredible network crossing the highest and most treacherous mountain range in the Americas, spanning deep gorges with suspension bridges woven from grass that had to be carefully rebuilt every year, climbing steep slopes on stone staircases carved with great precision into the rock, and connecting every corner of the vast empire to the capital at Cusco. And runners called chasquis carried messages along this extensive network so efficiently that fresh fish from the Pacific coast could reach the emperor's table in the mountains within days, communication faster than anything that existed in contemporary Europe at the time. Roads conquered the landscape. The Spanish conquered the Inca Empire with fewer than 200 soldiers. When Francisco Pizarro landed on the Peruvian coast in 1532, he brought with him a small band of heavily armed and battle-hardened Spanish conquistadors who faced a vast empire of millions of people. Yet within a single year, the Inca Emperor Atahualpa was dead, and the great empire was collapsing into complete ruin and chaos, undone by a brutal combination of Spanish steel and horses. Devastating European diseases that had already weakened and severely demoralized the population, and a brutal civil war that had deeply divided the Inca just as the invaders arrived. A perfect storm of catastrophe that handed one of history's greatest and most extensive empires to a handful of adventurers seeking gold and glory, leaving complete devastation in their brutal wake. Conquest came swiftly and completely. From the Andes, we traveled to the coast, where an older civilization left marks upon the earth. The Nazca lines were drawn so large that they can only be seen from the sky. On a high desert plateau in southern Peru, ancient people carefully removed the reddish pebbles from the surface to reveal the lighter ground beneath, creating lines and figures that stretch across the landscape for kilometers, images of spiders and hummingbirds and monkeys, and precise geometric shapes that were completely invisible to the people who made them, except perhaps from the surrounding hills. And their true scale was only understood when aircraft began flying over the region in the early 20th century, revealing a vast canvas of mysterious and ancient art that had waited hidden in plain sight for nearly 2,000 years, unseen by anyone until humans finally learned to fly and look down upon the earth from above. Art made for eyes that did not exist. Art waited for wings. Some of the Nazca figures stretch over 300 meters long. The largest geoglyphs are enormous beyond easy comprehension. A hummingbird nearly 100 meters from beak to graceful extended tail. A monkey with a long spiraling tail stretching more than 60 meters across the desert floor. A pelican over 280 meters long. And these remarkable and ancient figures were created with remarkable and astonishing precision despite their immense scale and size, suggesting that the Nazca people had developed sophisticated and advanced surveying techniques to maintain proportions accurately across such vast and empty distances, perhaps using carefully placed grids or tall sighting poles or ingenious methods we have yet to imagine or fully understand, turning the desert floor into a canvas that required the entire landscape to appreciate and understand fully, a gallery that dwarfs any human gallery ever constructed anywhere in the ancient world. Scale defied human vision. The purpose of the Nazca lines remains one of archaeology's greatest mysteries. Scholars have proposed dozens of different and often contradictory theories about these mysterious and ancient and beautiful figures etched into the desert floor, suggesting that the lines were astronomical calendars pointing to solstices and equinoxes, ceremonial pathways for sacred religious processions honoring powerful deities, offerings to mountain gods who could see them from their high peaks above, markers of underground water sources in the arid and unforgiving desert where water meant survival, or simply artistic expressions whose original meaning has been lost to time and remains deeply obscure, and each theory explains some features while failing to account for others, and the truth may well be that the lines served multiple different purposes over the many centuries they were created, their meaning shifting with the generations who walked among them. Purpose remains deeply uncertain. The Nazca people may have performed rituals walking along the lines. Some researchers believe that the lines themselves were the entire point, not the images they formed when viewed from above, that devoted pilgrims would walk along the paths for many hours as a form of meditation or prayer or quiet worship beneath the burning desert sun, and evidence of pottery fragments and offerings found at the ends of some lines suggests that ceremonies were indeed performed there by people seeking connection with the divine. And perhaps the act of walking the lines connected the Nazca to their gods or to their ancestors, a journey whose ultimate destination was less important than the sacred path itself, a sacred wandering across a landscape transformed by human hands into something deeply and mysteriously holy and utterly timeless, linking earth and sky in eternal and sacred connection. Walking was perhaps worship. The desert conditions have preserved the lines for nearly 2,000 years. The Nazca Plateau is one of the driest places on Earth, receiving less than a single centimeter of rain each year on average, and the remarkably stable and dry climate means there is almost no wind erosion, no violent floods to wash the lines away, no vegetation to grow over them and break up the carefully created patterns. And this remarkable cosmic preservation is also very fragile, threatened now by climate change and increasing human encroachment. And dedicated conservationists work constantly to protect the ancient lines from reckless off-road vehicles and looting, and the slow creep of urban development, trying to ensure that these ancient images survive intact into the many centuries to come, their ancient beauty undimmed by the passing of millennia, and preserved by the very dryness that defines this barren and otherworldly and windswept landscape. Dryness preserved what hands created. We now cross the Pacific Ocean to the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Khmer Empire built Angkor Wat, the largest religious monument on Earth. In the dense tropical jungles of Cambodia rises a truly magnificent temple complex that dwarfs every other religious monument ever constructed anywhere in the entire world. Its elegant towers reaching towards the sky in imitation of the cosmic mountain at the very center of the universe. Its galleries carved with kilometers of reliefs depicting gods and battles and daily life. And the Khmer kings who built it commanded resources that seem almost unimaginable. Many thousands of sculptors and laborers working for many decades to raise these sandstone mountains in the tropical heat, creating a masterpiece of religious architecture that still draws millions of visitors who come to watch the sunrise over the ancient towers, drawn by the same sense of awe that must have filled the hearts of those who first saw these magnificent structures rising from the jungle floor so many centuries ago. Stone reached for heaven. At its height, the Khmer capital was larger than any European city. The sprawling city of Angkor, at its impressive peak, covered an area of well over 1,000 square kilometers, making it one of the largest pre-industrial cities the world had ever seen, larger than modern New York or Tokyo, and modern satellite imagery and aerial photography has revealed the outlines of canals and reservoirs and temples stretching across the landscape, a metropolis that housed perhaps 1 million people when London was merely a muddy town of 30,000 souls. And the scale of this achievement is still being mapped by archaeologists using lasers that penetrate the jungle canopy to reveal structures hidden beneath the trees, an urban sprawl that challenges everything scholars once believed about what pre-modern civilizations could accomplish. Cities grew vast and complex. The Khmer engineered an elaborate water system that fed millions of people. The Khmer kings understood well that water was power in a monsoon climate, where rain fell in torrents for half the year and barely at all for the other half. And they built a vast network of enormous reservoirs, called barrays, that stored billions of liters of precious water, channeling it through canals to irrigate rice paddies that could produce 3 harvests every single year. And this engineering miracle fed the population that built the temples and fought the wars and created the art. A civilization that rose on the backs of farmers, whose fields were watered by the genius of their engineers and the labor of countless workers who dug the channels that sustained an empire. Water sustained an empire. Angkor was lost to the jungle for centuries before being rediscovered by European explorers. By the 16th century, the great and sacred temples of Angkor had been completely swallowed by the encroaching jungle, their ancient towers draped in thick vines and their grand courtyards home to massive banyan trees, whose roots cracked the ancient stones and slowly pried apart the carefully fitted blocks over many years. And local people knew they were there, but the outside world had forgotten. Until French explorers stumbled upon the ruins in the 1860s and brought back drawings and photographs that captivated European audiences, who struggled to believe that such monuments could have been built by people their colonial prejudices dismissed as primitive. A discovery that forced a reassessment of what Asian civilizations had achieved long before European contact ever occurred. Jungle concealed, then revealed. Climate change and water mismanagement may have contributed to the Khmer decline. Tree ring data and sediment cores suggest that the 14th and 15th centuries brought severe droughts followed by catastrophic floods, and the sophisticated water management system that had sustained the Khmer for centuries began to fail under these extreme and unpredictable conditions, canals silting up and reservoirs breaching their banks. And at the same time, the empire faced serious military pressure from the rising Thai kingdoms to the west. And eventually, the capital was abandoned and the population dispersed, leaving the temples to the jungle and the jungle to time, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations remain vulnerable to changes in the climate they depend upon entirely for their continued survival and prosperity, a warning that echoes across the centuries and speaks directly to the challenges and uncertainties that our own modern world now faces as the climate shifts beneath our feet. Climate changed, kingdoms fell. Let your mind rest for a moment. The temples of the jungle can wait. Let your body soften into the darkness, and when you are ready, we will continue walking through the ruins of time. From the temples of Angkor, we journey to the shores of the Mediterranean and the traders who connected the ancient world. The Phoenicians invented the alphabet that nearly every language uses today. The writing system you are reading right now descends directly from symbols first scratched on clay tablets in the bustling trading ports of what is now Lebanon, where busy merchants needed a quick and efficient way to record their transactions, and invented an elegant alphabet of just 22 letters that could represent any sound in their language. And this elegant and revolutionary simplification spread to the Greeks, and then the Romans, and eventually the entire world. A gift from anonymous traders whose names are lost, but whose invention has shaped every civilization that came after, allowing ordinary people to become literate with months of study rather than the years required to master cuneiform or hieroglyphics or other complex writing systems. Letters changed everything. Phoenician ships reached as far as Britain and possibly even further. These fearless and highly experienced sailors navigated by the stars in sturdy cedarwood ships, built with remarkable craftsmanship, that could carry heavy cargoes across the unpredictable and often dangerous open Mediterranean and far beyond, trading tin from far Cornwall and amber from the cold Baltic and precious gold from distant West Africa. and some scholars believe they even circumnavigated the entire vast African continent 2,000 years before the Portuguese eventually did. Though the surviving archaeological evidence remains tantalizing rather than conclusive, and everywhere they went they established trading posts and permanent colonies that spread their language and their gods and their innovations, creating networks of commerce that connected the ancient world long before empires and armies imposed their own kinds of unity. Sails carried civilization forward. The Phoenicians founded Carthage, which almost destroyed Rome. On the coast of North Africa, where Tunisia now stands, Phoenician colonists founded a powerful city called Carthage that grew into a mighty and influential commercial empire controlling the Western Mediterranean. And for over a century, Carthage and Rome fought for supremacy in long and brutal wars that nearly extinguished the Roman state completely, as the brilliant general Hannibal brought his war elephants across the Alps and slaughtered Roman armies in Italy for years. And in the end, Rome won and destroyed Carthage so thoroughly that they plowed salt into the fields to prevent it from ever rising again, a destruction so complete that we know this civilization mainly through the writings of its bitter enemies, who painted them as monsters and villains while conveniently forgetting the cultural achievements that were lost when the flames consumed everything. Victory erased the vanquished. Tyrian purple, made from sea snails, was worth more than gold. The murex snail that lived in the warm coastal waters off Phoenicia secreted a compound that produced a vibrant and brilliant purple dye that did not fade in sunlight or repeated washing, and extracting this precious dye required crushing many thousands of small snails for just a few grams of pigment, making Tyrian purple so expensive that only royalty and nobility could afford to wear it, and the color became synonymous with power and wealth throughout the ancient world. Purple robes marking emperors and kings, while common people wore undyed wool, a hierarchy of color that persisted for millennia and crossed many different cultures until synthetic dyes made purple available to everyone regardless of their social position or wealth. Wealth was measured in color. The Phoenicians left behind almost no literature because they wrote on papyrus that decayed. Unlike the Egyptians who carved their records in imperishable stone, or the Mesopotamians who pressed them into durable clay, the Phoenicians wrote on fragile papyrus scrolls that crumbled to dust in the damp Mediterranean climate. And although they must have possessed extensive libraries of poetry and history and philosophy and religious texts, almost nothing has survived from this vast and influential civilization that invented the alphabet. A cruel irony that leaves us knowing their letters but not their literature, their trading networks but not their stories, and the myths they told their children around evening fires. Only silence where there should be voices speaking the words that gave birth to our own, words that shaped the very foundation of written communication. Writing survived, words vanished. We now travel inland to the heartland of Anatolia, where a forgotten empire once rivaled Egypt. The Hittites were the first civilization to smelt iron on a large scale. In the mountains of Anatolia, Hittite smiths discovered how to extract iron from ore at temperatures high enough to make the metal workable, a remarkable breakthrough that would eventually end the entire Bronze Age and transform warfare and agriculture across the entire ancient world. And for many centuries, they guarded this valuable secret jealously, controlling the supply of iron weapons and powerful tools that gave their armies a crucial advantage over neighbors still fighting with much softer bronze. And although their iron was not yet true steel and was often inferior to good bronze, the knowledge they possessed would spread eventually after their empire fell and change the world forever in ways we still feel today, transforming weapons and tools and agriculture in a revolution that would reshape every civilization that followed. Metal reshaped civilization. The Hittite kingdom was completely forgotten until the 19th century. For over 2,000 years, the Hittites were absent from history, mentioned only in a few puzzling references in the Bible and Egyptian records that scholars could not explain, until archaeologists excavating in central Turkey discovered the ruins of their capital Hattusa in the 1880s and began deciphering tablets in a language no one had heard for millennia. And suddenly, an entire empire emerged from the sand. A great power that had once challenged Egypt for control of the ancient Near East, completely forgotten for longer than Western civilization has existed. A reminder of how much of our past lies still buried and waiting to be found beneath the soil of forgotten landscapes, waiting for the archaeologist who will one day bring it back into the light of human awareness and scholarly understanding. An empire returned from oblivion. The Battle of Kadesh between the Hittites and Egyptians ended in the world's first recorded peace treaty. In 1274 BCE, the vast armies of two great empires clashed at Kadesh in what is now Syria, chariots thundering across the dusty plain as Hittite and Egyptian warriors fought for supremacy over valuable trade routes. And when the battle ended inconclusively, both sides claimed victory and eventually negotiated a treaty that has survived in both Hittite and Egyptian copies, promising eternal peace and mutual defense against enemies. A remarkably modern document that recognized the legitimacy of both powers and ended decades of bitter warfare. And a replica of this treaty now hangs proudly in the United Nations building as a symbol of humanity's long struggle to find alternatives to endless war and bloodshed. A reminder that the desire for peace is as old as the impulse toward conflict and destruction. Diplomacy followed slaughter. Hittite cuneiform tablets reveal a thriving legal system. The royal archives at Hattusa contained many thousands of clay tablets recording laws that seem remarkably sophisticated to modern eyes, carefully distinguishing between intentional and accidental harm, prescribing different penalties based on the social status of victim and offender and the particular circumstances of the crime, and showing a level of legal reasoning that would not look out of place in a modern courtroom today. And these tablets also preserve treaties and diplomatic correspondence that reveal a complex international system of alliances and rivalries. Letters between kings who addressed each other as brothers while secretly plotting each other's eventual downfall. The ancient world in all its beautifully complicated reality preserved in baked clay. Diplomacy and deception intertwined in ways that would seem entirely familiar to anyone who has studied the politics of any era, including our own modern age. Laws governed even ancient kings. The Hittite Empire collapsed suddenly around 1200 BCE as part of a mysterious Bronze Age collapse. Around 1200 BCE, the mighty Hittite Empire suddenly disappeared with startling and sudden swiftness. Its great and ancient cities burned and abandoned, its population scattered across the region, its great capital Hattusa left to crumble in the Anatolian highlands, part of a terrifying wave of destruction that swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean and brought down civilizations that had endured for many centuries. And the causes remain debated among scholars who point to invading peoples and internal rebellions and droughts and earthquakes and disrupted trade networks, perhaps all combining in a perfect storm of catastrophe that ended the Bronze Age and plunged the region into a dark age that would last for centuries. A collapse so complete that it would take generations before civilization could rebuild what had been so suddenly and thoroughly destroyed by forces both human and natural. Greatness faded into silence. And now we turn to that great collapse, when civilization itself seemed to fall apart. Around 1200 BCE, nearly every major civilization in the Mediterranean collapsed within a single lifetime. Within a few short decades, the great civilizations that had dominated the late Bronze Age lay in smoking ruins. Palace economies that had carefully coordinated trade across thousands of miles, collapsing as cities burned, and populations fled, and literacy itself was lost in some regions completely. And the interconnected world of the 13th century BCE gave way to isolated and scattered communities struggling to survive in a landscape suddenly emptied of the institutions that had structured life for many centuries. And this devastating collapse remains one of the great and enduring mysteries of ancient history. A stark and humbling reminder that complex systems can fail suddenly and completely when too many stresses accumulate at once and overwhelm every defense that civilization has carefully built over generations. Complexity collapsed into chaos. The Sea Peoples attacked Egypt, Greece, and Anatolia, but no one knows exactly who they were. Egyptian records carved in temple walls describe terrifying waves of attackers coming by land and by sea in vast fleets of ships. Peoples with strange and unfamiliar names, like the Peliset and Tejeker and Shekelesh, who swept down through Anatolia, destroying everything in their path, before being finally turned back at the very borders of Egypt itself by the armies of Ramesses III. And scholars have spent over a century trying to identify these mysterious sea peoples with known groups, suggesting they were refugees from the collapsing civilizations or raiders from the Western Mediterranean, or some combination of displaced peoples caught up in a destructive wave that fed on itself and grew ever stronger. But no certain answer has emerged from the available evidence, only the marks of burning on broken stones. The attackers remain nameless. The Mycenaean Greeks, who fought the Trojan War, vanished during this period. The ancient Greeks who sailed to Troy and whose exploits Homer would immortalize centuries later were part of a sophisticated civilization centered on fortified palaces at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos, a culture of warriors and traders whose linear B tablets reveal a complex bureaucracy managing flocks of sheep and distributions of bronze. And around 1200 BCE, this civilization too collapsed completely, its great palaces destroyed, and its elaborate writing system lost, initiating a Greek Dark Age from which only faint memories of heroes and monsters would survive to inspire later generations who dimly remembered a time when kings had ruled from walls of Cyclopean stone, warriors who defended citadels that seemed built by giants, a golden age that faded into legend and song and the distant echoes of a world that would never return. Heroes faded into myth. Trade routes that had connected the ancient world suddenly went silent. Before the collapse, ships had carried tin from distant Afghanistan and copper from Cyprus and gold from Egypt along routes that connected distant and prosperous civilizations in a Bronze Age global economy, and letters between kings show rulers requesting iron daggers and exotic goods, and elaborate and precious shipments as gifts between equals. And when this intricate network failed, the consequences cascaded through every society that depended on imported materials. Bronze becoming scarce when tin no longer arrived from the east, craftsmen unable to work without the materials their skills required, economies built on long-distance trade discovering too late how vulnerable their prosperity had become, how fragile the threads of commerce truly were, how quickly everything could unravel when the ships stopped sailing and the caravans stopped walking, and the whole interconnected system fell silent and still. Silence replaced the hum of commerce. Some scholars believe climate change and drought triggered the collapse. Tree ring data from ancient timbers and pollen samples from lake sediments suggest that the 12th century BCE brought severe and prolonged droughts to the entire eastern Mediterranean region. And some scholars argue that failing harvests created desperate refugees who became the feared sea peoples as desperation turned farmers into fierce raiders, while others point to powerful earthquakes that struck multiple cities within a few decades. And perhaps all these factors, combined with internal rebellions and the inherent fragility of palace economies, to create a cascade of failures that no single civilization could withstand. A systemic collapse rather than a single disaster, complexity becoming fatal vulnerability, systems buckling under pressures they were never designed to endure. Many causes, one catastrophic result. We now venture into the realm of legend, where history blurs with myths. Plato's description of Atlantis may have been inspired by real events. In his famous dialogues, the Greek philosopher described an island empire that sank beneath the waves in a single day and night of terrible destruction, a story he claimed had been passed down from Egyptian priests. And while most scholars believe Atlantis was a philosophical fable meant to illustrate the corruption of power, some have wondered whether distant memories of real catastrophes inspired the tale. Perhaps the volcanic destruction of the Minoan civilization on Thera, or some other disaster lost to time, and the search for Atlantis has become a kind of archaeology of the imagination, revealing more about our dreams of lost golden ages than about any actual place that ever truly existed, a mirror held up to our own longing for worlds more perfect than the one we inhabit, civilizations wiser than our own. Myth often contains seeds of memory. The lost city of Dwarka, said to be Krishna's kingdom, may lie beneath the sea off India. Hindu texts describe a magnificent city ruled by the god Krishna that was swallowed by the sea after his death, and underwater archaeologists exploring the waters off the coast of Gujarat in western India have found what appear to be ancient and fascinating structures beneath the waves, walls, and streets, and what might be the remains of a civilization that flourished when sea levels were much lower many thousands of years ago. And while the identification with the legendary Dwarka remains controversial, the discoveries suggest that tales of sunken cities may well preserve genuine memories of places drowned by rising oceans at the end of the last ice age. History disguised as mythology waiting for discovery, legends holding truths that science is only now beginning to confirm with modern technology. Waters rose over ancient stones. The legend of Lemuria began as a scientific hypothesis that was later abandoned. In the 19th century, a British zoologist named Philip Sclater proposed that a lost continent called Lemuria once connected Madagascar to India across the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean, explaining the similar and puzzling distribution of lemurs and several other unique species on both isolated landmasses separated by thousands of miles of open water. And while continental drift theory later rendered this hypothesis completely scientifically obsolete and unnecessary, the romantic idea of Lemuria was eagerly adopted by occultists and various mystics who imagined it as the homeland of an ancient and spiritually advanced race that possessed wisdom beyond our understanding. And this fascinating transformation from scientific speculation to spiritual fantasy reveals how the human imagination seizes upon the idea of lost worlds and transforms them into repositories of magical knowledge that mainstream science has supposedly suppressed. Science became mythology. El Dorado was never a city of gold. It was a king covered in gold dust. Spanish conquistadors heard tales of a ruler called El Dorado, the Golden One, who covered himself in gold dust for sacred rituals and then washed it off in a sacred lake as an offering to the gods. And over time, this story transformed into legends of a magnificent city of gold hidden somewhere in the South American interior, sending countless explorers into the jungle in search of wealth that existed only in imagination, and many of them died in the search. Victims not of hostile natives, but of their own greed and the dangerous terrain, pursuing a phantom that grew more elaborate with each retelling of the tale, a mirage of riches that consumed the lives of those who sought it. Gold existed only in legend. The Amazons, once dismissed as myth, may have been based on real warrior women of the steppes. Greek myths told of a nation of fierce warrior women who lived at the edges of the known world, and archaeologists excavating Scythian burial mounds on the Eurasian steppes have found female skeletons buried with weapons and bearing the marks of combat wounds, suggesting that among the nomadic peoples of the vast grasslands, women did indeed ride to war alongside men. And perhaps Greek travelers encountering these impressive mounted warriors brought home incredible stories that fed the legend of the Amazons, a reminder that ancient myths sometimes preserve garbled memories of customs that seemed so strange to foreign observers that they could only be explained as fiction by those who heard them, tales of warrior women that were more real than anyone imagined. Warriors were not always men. From legend, we return to the work of archaeologists who bring lost worlds back to light. Heinrich Schliemann discovered Troy by trusting the words of Homer. While professional scholars dismissed the Homeric poems as pure fiction, a wealthy German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann believed that Troy had been a real place and set out to find it. And in 1870, he began carefully excavating at Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, uncovering layer after layer of ancient cities stretching back many thousands of years. And although his methods were crude by modern standards, and he probably dug through the Troy of the Trojan War without recognizing it, his discovery proved that epic poetry could preserve genuine memories of the Bronze Age past, opening a new chapter in the study of the ancient world and inspiring future archaeologists to look for history in the pages of legend. Literature led to discovery. Howard Carter spent years searching before he found Tutankhamun's tomb. For 5 long years, the British archaeologist Howard Carter excavated in the Valley of the Kings, finding nothing of real significance, while his patron Lord Carnarvon grew increasingly frustrated and repeatedly threatened to withdraw all funding from the expensive and seemingly fruitless expedition. And then in the November of 1922, workers uncovered a step cut into the rock that led to a sealed doorway. And behind that door lay the most complete royal tomb ever discovered in all of ancient Egypt. 4 magnificent rooms filled with treasures that had lain undisturbed for over 3,000 years. A glimpse of pharaonic splendor that captured the imagination of the entire world and sparked a lasting and enduring global fascination with ancient Egypt and its mysteries. Persistence revealed ancient glory. Pompeii was buried under volcanic ash and forgotten for nearly 1,700 years. When Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE with devastating and unexpected fury, it buried the Roman town of Pompeii under several meters of volcanic ash that preserved everything from loaves of bread left in ovens to the final desperate positions of those who died in the terrible disaster, their bodies creating cavities in the hardened ash that archaeologists later carefully filled with plaster to create haunting casts of ordinary people frozen in their last terrified moments. And this accidental time capsule has given scholars an unparalleled window into daily Roman life 2,000 years ago, streets and shops and homes preserved as if abandoned only yesterday, a city stopped in time by the terrible catastrophe that destroyed it, frozen in one horrific moment forever. Death preserved ordinary life. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe rewrote everything we thought we knew about early civilization. In southern Turkey stands a complex of massive stone pillars carved with animals that were erected over 11,000 years ago, before the invention of pottery or the domestication of crops, by hunter-gatherers who somehow organized the labor to move and very carefully carve enormous limestone blocks weighing many tons. And this remarkable discovery has forced archaeologists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the origins of civilization, suggesting that monumental architecture and complex religion may have preceded agriculture rather than following it, that the urge to build temples may have been part of what drove our ancestors to settle down and begin farming the land, to stay in one place and cultivate the earth. A revolution in human behavior triggered not by practical necessity, but by something deeper, a spiritual hunger that transformed the way our species lived and organized itself forever after. Temples came before cities. Modern technology like LiDAR is revealing hidden cities beneath jungle canopies. Light detection and ranging technology mounted on aircraft flying low over the jungle canopy can penetrate dense forest canopy and map the ground beneath with stunning precision. And in recent years, this remarkable technology has revealed the outlines of vast urban complexes hidden beneath the jungles of Guatemala and Cambodia and other places where dense vegetation had concealed the works of ancient hands from human eyes. Cities with populations in the hundreds of thousands, complete with roads and reservoirs and agricultural terraces, places that satellite photographs showed as unbroken forest, but which LiDAR revealed as entire landscapes shaped entirely by human labor. The ghosts of civilizations made visible by lasers fired from the sky, a technology that allows us to see what previous generations could never have imagined, an archaeology that reads the earth itself from the heavens above. Technology reveals what time has hidden. These discoveries remind us that the past is never truly gone. Let yourself rest among its echoes. Breathe slowly. The final stories of the night are just ahead. We now consider the many ways that civilizations come to end. Some civilizations fell because they exhausted the land that fed them. The great cities of the Maya lowlands were abandoned over centuries as populations grew beyond what the surrounding jungle could sustain, and intensive agriculture stripped the thin tropical soils of nutrients faster than they could be replenished, and deforestation for fuel and building materials altered local rainfall patterns in ways the Maya could not have predicted or understood. And when the rains failed and the crops withered and the reservoirs ran dry, the people simply left in search of better land, leaving their magnificent temples to be swallowed by the forest that now grew back over the exhausted fields. A story repeated across cultures and continents wherever human ambition outpaced the patience of the earth. A warning that prosperity built on unsustainable foundations will eventually collapse no matter how impressive it may appear to those who benefit from it. The land had its limits. Internal conflict and civil war destroyed kingdoms from within. The great palace of Knossos on Crete may have been destroyed not by foreign invasion, but by rebellion from within the Minoan world. And across history, we see the same pattern repeated. Elites growing distant from the people they ruled, resources concentrated in fewer and fewer hands, resentment building in the provinces until someone finally struck the first blow, and the magnificent structures that had taken generations to build came crashing down in months of violence. And sometimes those who burned the palace were the children of those who had built it, and the memories of these internal struggles were often erased by later generations who preferred stories of glorious defeat by foreign enemies to the shameful truth of self-destruction. Kingdoms consumed themselves. Disease brought by outsiders devastated populations who had no immunity. When European ships reached the Americas, they carried invisible passengers in the form of smallpox and measles and typhus and influenza, diseases that had evolved alongside Old World populations for thousands of years, but were utterly unknown to those who lived in the Western Hemisphere. And the result was catastrophe on a scale difficult to comprehend. with some scholars estimating that 90% of the indigenous population perished within a century of first contact. Entire cultures disappearing not through conquest, but through contagion, their songs and stories and knowledge dying with the last survivors who could remember them, and the Spanish who arrived afterward found empty cities and untended fields and wondered at the silence, never fully understanding that they themselves had been the angels of death. Microbes conquered empires. The arrival of new technologies sometimes rendered entire cultures obsolete. When iron became widely available across the Mediterranean and the Near East, the civilizations that had built their power on the control of bronze and its component metals suddenly found their monopolies broken, and their armies outmatched by peoples who had previously been considered barbarians. And the same pattern has repeated throughout history: nomads on horseback overrunning settled farmers, sailors with guns subduing ancient kingdoms, industrial nations absorbing traditional societies. And each wave of technological change has left behind the wreckage of cultures that could not adapt quickly enough, their ways of life becoming curiosities for museums rather than living practices, a reminder that no advantage is permanent and that the weapons of one age become the relics of the next. Progress left ruins behind. Sometimes civilizations did not collapse at all, they simply transformed into something new. The Roman Empire did not end so much as it slowly changed, its western half fragmenting into successor kingdoms whose rulers still claimed Roman titles and followed Roman laws even as they spoke new languages and worshipped different gods. And the eastern half continued for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, preserving much of the classical heritage that would later spark the Renaissance in Western Europe, and similar transformations occurred across the world. Old cultures merging with new arrivals to create hybrid civilizations that looked different but carried the seeds of what had come before. And perhaps collapse is not the right word at all for processes that stretched across centuries and left so much behind. Endings were also beginnings. And now, as our journey draws to a close, we reflect on the legacy of those who came before. The ruins of lost civilizations remind us that nothing lasts forever. We walk through ancient temples whose builders believed they were creating something eternal and everlasting, and we read inscriptions in which kings declared that their names would live forever. And we know that those names were forgotten for many millennia until patient scholars learned to read the dead scripts again. And there is something both humbling and deeply comforting in this knowledge. Because if the mightiest empires of antiquity could crumble to dust, then perhaps our own anxieties about the uncertain future are simply part of a much older story, and the monuments we build today will one day be ruins for future peoples to puzzle over. And that is not a tragedy, but simply the nature of time itself, the eternal rhythm of civilization rising and falling like breath, like the tides, like everything in the natural world around us. Stone teaches humility. The inventions of forgotten peoples shape the world we live in today. The wheel and the plow and writing and mathematics and astronomy and medicine all emerged from civilizations whose names most people have never heard. And the alphabet you are reading now descends from symbols invented by Phoenician merchants over 3,000 years ago. And the number 0 that makes modern computing possible was developed by Indian mathematicians, whose works were translated by Arab scholars who passed them to medieval Europe. And every time we use these tools, we are participating in a continuous tradition of innovation that stretches back to the earliest cities, each generation building upon the discoveries of those who came before, standing on the shoulders of anonymous ancestors we have forgotten, but who made our world possible. The past lives in every equation. Languages die, but sometimes they are reborn through patient scholarship. For centuries, no one could read the hieroglyphics carved into Egyptian monuments, and the knowledge preserved in cuneiform tablets was locked away in shapes that scholars could describe but not understand. But then came the decipherments, Champollion with his Rosetta Stone and Rawlinson scaling the cliff at Behistun. And suddenly, the voices of people dead for 3,000 years could be heard once more, their prayers and their love letters and their legal contracts and their jokes. The full range of human experience preserved in clay and stone and waiting for someone patient enough to listen. And there are still scripts that have not been decoded, languages that may yet speak again if we can find the key. Words outlast pyramids. The descendants of lost civilizations are still with us, carrying their ancestors' genes in their blood. The people of modern Iraq are descended from Sumerians and Babylonians, and the people of modern Mexico carry Maya and Aztec ancestry in their DNA, and the people of Peru can trace their lineage back to the Inca and the many cultures that came before them. And all across the world, the biological legacy of vanished civilizations lives on in populations that may have forgotten the old names and the old languages, but whose very existence proves that nothing ever truly disappears. That every civilization leaves behind not just ruins and artifacts, but living human beings who carry the story forward into the future, whether they consciously know it or realize it or not, breathing reminders that the past is never truly gone, but lives on in every heartbeat and every generation that follows after. Ancestry connects all time. Every city we build today will, one day, become an archaeological site for future explorers. The towers of glass and steel that seem so permanent and unshakable will eventually crumble in time, just as all monuments crumble. And future scholars will sift through the debris of our shopping centers and our airports and our data centers, trying to understand what manner of people we were and how we lived our daily lives. And they will make mistakes just as we make mistakes about the past, interpreting our habits through the lens of their own assumptions and cultural biases. And perhaps they will romanticize us the way we romanticize the Romans and the Greeks. And perhaps they will wonder how such an advanced civilization could have been so blind to certain dangers that they can see so clearly in retrospect. And the cycle will continue as it has always continued throughout human history. The future will excavate us. We are the living continuation of a story that began long before history was written. Every aspect of modern life connects back to decisions made by people we will never know. From the crops we eat that were first domesticated over 10,000 years ago, to the social structures that evolved in the earliest cities, to the religious and philosophical ideas that have been debated and refined across countless generations. And we are not separate from the past, but rather its living expression. The current chapter of an ancient narrative that began when the first humans gathered around fires and started telling stories about where they came from and what their lives meant. And that story will not end with us, but will continue through those who come after. We are both the heirs and the ancestors. The silence left by vanished peoples is not absence. It is a kind of presence we have not yet learned to hear. In the empty plazas of abandoned cities, there is a stillness that feels almost intentional, as if the builders had left behind not just their monuments, but something of themselves, some echo of their presence that lingers in the arrangement of stones and the angles of shadows, and the way the wind moves through doorways that no one has passed through for 1,000 years. And if we are quiet enough and patient enough, we can sometimes feel that presence. Not as something supernatural, but as the simple fact of human continuity, the awareness that others stood where we stand and wondered about those who would come after them, just as we wonder now about those who will one day walk through the ruins of everything we have built and everything we believed would last forever. Emptiness holds memory. And somewhere beneath our feet, there are still civilizations waiting to be found, hidden under the weight of centuries and soil. Despite centuries of archaeology, we have barely scratched the surface of what lies buried under fields and forests and modern cities, and new technologies reveal new sites every year. From LiDAR scans uncovering vast Maya cities to ground-penetrating radar finding Roman villas beneath English meadows. And the Earth holds secrets we cannot yet imagine, entire chapters of human history still unwritten, because the evidence has not yet been unearthed. And perhaps the most exciting discoveries of all are still ahead of us, waiting in the ground for someone with the patience and the luck and the curiosity to find them and share them with the world. And in this way, the study of the past remains forever young, always offering the promise of revelation. Discovery has no end. And so the echoes of lost civilizations settle gently into stillness. Tonight, we have walked through forgotten cities and crumbling temples, from the first settlements of Anatolia to the golden palaces of the Khmer, from the painted warriors of the north to the stargazing Maya of the jungle. We have traced the rise and fall of empires, heard the whisper of scripts no one can read, and stood at the edge of mysteries that have waited centuries for answers. These are the stories the Earth keeps, written in stone and silence. If these journeys through history have helped you rest, consider leaving a like or subscribing. There are more quiet wonders waiting in the nights ahead, more distant worlds, more forgotten stories, more gentle truths to carry you into sleep. Right now, as you lie here, the echoes of these ancient peoples still resonate in the world around you. The roads they built still run beneath modern highways. The calendars they invented still count your days. The languages they shaped still live on your lips. You are not separate from this history. You are part of it. Let your eyes close now, if they have not already. Let your breath grow slow, deep, easy. Feel the weight of your body sinking gently into rest. There is nothing more for you to do. The ancient cities are quiet now. The scribes have put down their styluses. The temples have grown still. Let your mind do the same. Tonight, as you rest, the ruins of lost civilizations remain beneath the soil. The statues keep their silent vigil. The unread inscriptions wait for future scholars. The pyramids stand beneath distant stars. You are a small, warm presence among this vast history, peacefully resting among the wonders. Sleep well, sweet dreams, and may the quiet knowledge that you are part of an unbroken human story bring you comfort through the night. This has been Drowsy Discovery. Good night.